Sometimes a small change is all that's needed to take a build to new heights. Hello, I'm Surgeon General. In this video, I will be showcasing an interaction possible in the Secrets of the Atlas expansion, which uses self-damage to automate the generation of frenzy, power, and endurance charges. This new tech enables a twist on an existing build archetype, the Discharge Slayer, which in Mercenaries League specifically can multiply the damage of the build by a factor of about 4, resulting in an average hit of over 170 million damage, enough to one-shot most enemies in the game and phase even the Uber bosses in 1 or 2 hits. While mapping can be a little clunky with the main skill on a 2-second cooldown and a relatively low physical max hit, the screen-wide area of effect and reasonable recovery makes it suitable for even tier 17 content. In this video, I will show how the charge generation mechanic works, discuss why this is useful specifically in Mercenaries League, and provide a showcase and build explanation for the character shown as well as some possible variants. Let's get into the mechanics. The Discharge Slayer is a known build archetype. There are a handful of players that play at each league. The main gimmick of the build is combining Slayer's Masterful Form Ascendancy with Badge of the Brotherhood. Masterful Form sets the player's maximum endurance charges equal to their maximum frenzy charges. In turn, Badge of the Brotherhood sets maximum frenzy charges equal to maximum power charges. Combining the two lets the player invest in power charge increases only and get matching increases to the other types. You can get 10 or 11 maximum charges of each type this way. Discharge scales its base damage with the number of charges that are expended on use. On a character with 10 of each charge, they'll already be hitting for almost 40,000 base damage before any increases or multipliers from passives and support gems. The main issue that this build has to solve is generating all of those charges. In the past, this has pretty much always been accomplished by using Replica Farrul's fur. This unique body armor causes the player to gain up to their maximum number of frenzy and endurance charges when they gain Cat's agility, which is 1/2 of the aspect of the Cat skill. By stacking reduced duration on aspect of the Cat, for example by taking Window of Opportunity on the skill tree and socketing less duration support in the item granting the aspect, you can force the aspect to cycle in under a couple of seconds. Since the cooldown on Discharge is 2 seconds, you always had charges available to expend. However, remember that Discharge deals all 3 elemental damage types. Expending power charges grants base lightning damage, frenzy is cold, and endurance fire. With damage spread out across all 3 elements, it's significantly harder to scale your damage against enemy resistances in the endgame. In Mercenaries League, there's a great workaround for this problem. We can equip a Mercenary with Doryani's prototype, which causes nearby enemies to have lightning resistance equal to our Mercenaries. We can then give the Mercenary reflected jewelry with a large negative lightning resistance roll, lowering their lightning resistance to the minimum value of -200. In turn, this causes enemies to have -200 lightning resistance as well. We can make this negative lightning resistance apply to all elemental types by wearing the Admiral on our own character, thanks to its unique effect, which makes elemental damage that we deal with hits be resisted by the enemy's lowest elemental resistance instead. If we can pull this off, it's a massive damage multiplier to the Discharge build, resulting in 400 or 500% more damage. The problem is that the Admiral is a unique body armor, which conflicts with the typical way that the build generates charges via Replica Farrul's fur. What we need is a new way to generate charges. Fortunately, there's some new charge generation tech in patch 3.26 that opens up the body armor slot. The new charge generation mechanic relies on the timeless jewel keystone Supreme Grandstanding. Supreme Grandstanding provides 2 effects. First, it causes allies and enemies to share charges with you, making you gain charges when they do. Second, it makes enemies have a 10% chance to gain a frenzy, power, or endurance charge whenever they hit you. The intended use of this keystone is to let enemies hit you. A small portion of the time those enemies will gain a charge, but since you share charges with nearby enemies, you will also gain a charge at the same time. However, there is another possibly unintended use of this keystone. Note that the charge generation line grants charges to enemies hitting you. What if you hit yourself? Can you be your own enemy? The answer is yes. Scold's Bridle is a unique helmet that causes the character to take a physical damage hit proportional to the mana spent on skills. With Scold's Bridle equipped, whenever you spend mana on a skill, you will hit yourself. This hit can activate the charge generation effect of Supreme's Grandstanding. However, since you are also the source of that incoming hit, that charge will be granted to you. In summary, the combination of Scold's Bridle and Supreme Grandstanding grants the player a 10% chance to generate one of the 3 standard charges whenever they spend mana on a skill. Unfortunately, this 10% chance is too low to be reliable, and there's no way to increase it. If we want to use this tech to generate a meaningful number of charges, we need to automate the self-hit process so that it occurs very quickly. If you've watched my previous video, you may see where this is going. Bladefall of Trarthus is a new skill gem introduced in patch 3.26, which, unlike most skills, spends mana over time instead of as an upfront cost when activating the skill. There is no duration on the skill, so as long as you can afford the per second mana cost, you can turn on Bladefall of Trarthus at the beginning of the map and it will remain active the entire instance. Since we're constantly spending mana while the Bladefall of Trarthus effect is active, Scold's Bridle is constantly dealing self-damage physical hits. This effect occurs on every server frame, 30 times per second. Each of these hits can proc the effect of Supreme Grandstanding. At a rate of 30 attempts per second, with a 10% chance to generate a charge each time, we expect to gain a charge 3 times per second. The charge type is chosen at random, so on average we will gain 1 of each charge per second. This is a significant improvement, and would be more than enough for any build that just wants to keep their charges topped off. However, if we want to use this tech with Discharge, which expends all of the player's charges, we need to further multiply the charge generation rate. We'd like to be able to fill our charges within the 2-second cooldown window of Discharge, meaning we need to be able to generate about 5 of each charge per second. We can do this in 2 ways. For endurance charges, we can simply take the Inexorable wheel on the passive skill tree. As shown in my previous video, Inexorable provides a 25% chance to gain a charge when hit, which is procced every server frame by our Scold's Bridle self-hits. This alone generates on average more than 7 endurance charges per second, completely solving the endurance charge generation rate needed for Discharge. Power and Frenzy charges are a little more difficult. Instead of just trying to gain more charges, we will instead take the existing charge generation rate from Supreme Grandstanding and use sources of chance that if you would gain charges, you instead gain up to your maximum number of charges. This stat gives us a chance to immediately fill our charges whenever the Supreme Grandstanding effect triggers. For power charges, we can get a 25% chance to gain up to the maximum by using the unique boots Inya's Epiphany. For frenzy charges, we'll use a Precursor's Emblem to get a 15% chance to gain up to maximum in either ring slot for a total of 30%. Paired with the charge generation from the Supreme Grandstanding tech, this will refill our charges on average every 4 seconds or so, still a bit short of the every 2 seconds needed to enable good uptime for Discharge. Fortunately, we can supplement this charge generation by spamming the Frenzy skill between uses of Discharge. Frenzy grants the player a Frenzy charge when it hits, and by linking it to Power Charge and Critical Strike support, we also have a high chance to be given a Power Charge when using the same skill. The added charge generation from the Frenzy setup, paired with our chance to gain up to maximum charges, plus the natural generation from Supreme Grandstanding, is enough to have nearly perfect uptime on all 3 charge types, while still using Discharge on cooldown. Having developed a way to generate all 3 types of charges without using Farrul's fur, we're now free to use the Admiral body armor with Doryani's prototype on our Mercenary, setting all enemy resistances equal to -200. This is a massive damage multiplier for the build, giving us over 300% more damage and bringing the build's average hit to over 170 million. At this level of damage, solo players can one-shot most enemies in the game, including pinnacle bosses once their boss armor wears off. I use this build to farm all the pinnacle content needed for this league's challenges. While the playstyle is a little clunky for general mapping, I've had a lot of success with boss rushing Maven invitations with destructive play. A Mageblood Quicksilver Flask makes the boss maps quick to run, and the invitations themselves take only seconds with this level of damage. I've also used it for some essence farming. You can just open the essence and then one-tap the essence monster. In this section, I will briefly overview the character's ascendancy, equipment, and skill tree, and discuss where you might want to deviate from the template I've provided. There's a path of building link in the video description so you can tinker with different options as you wish. The Slayer Ascendancy skill Masterful Form is absolutely mandatory. It forms the basis for our charge stacking mechanic. I take Bane of Legends for a nice 20% more damage multiplier against bosses, and then take the 2 leech nodes for quality of life. The convenience of Life Overleech from Brutal Fervor is hard to beat for this type of build, where we don't hit that frequently, and Endless Hunger gives us stun and bleed immunity just for quality of life. While I've chosen to play as a Slayer, you could also steal Masterful Form with the Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame jewels and play as a champion. This is a more defensive option, but is certainly still viable as long as you can afford the 2 additional jewel sockets needed for the Forbidden Jewels. If you go this route, you'll want to invest more into life regeneration to compensate for the life recovery lost from Slayer Leech. Most of our character's gear is unique equipment to support the charge stacking and charge generation mechanics as shown previously. Note that this build is required to use a Precursor's Emblem in the ring slot. The mods on the Precursor's Emblems are randomly generated from a set pool, similar to with Watcher's Eyes. The mandatory mod needed for this build is 15% chance to instead gain up to maximum frenzy charges. Now, ideally, you'll also get +1 maximum power charge on this ring as well. However, this specific combination is going to be exceedingly rare, so you can't expect to be able to find one. Fortunately, the build is still very much playable without the perfect ring. You give up about 40 million damage on your average hit, but we do so much damage already that that's still a 130 million damage hit, more than enough for almost all content. Once you source a suitable ring, you'll want to use Kalandra's Touch in your other ring slot to double its effect. Since we're so heavily invested in unique gear, Mageblood is almost necessary on this build in order to cap our resists. I use a Bismuth and Amethyst Flask to get my needed resistances, and then increase my maximum elemental resistances using a Ruby Flask combined with Purity of Fire and Melding of the Flesh. My final flask base is a Quicksilver Flask. The movement speed is nice just for quality of life. For the 5th flask spot, I use a Bottled Faith, which helps cap my critical strike chance and applies some increased damage taken. For Genesis is another option if you prefer to increase your maximum hit taken. Our only rare is in the glove slot. All we need from the explicits on the gloves is as much life and resistance as possible. You'll want to use Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds implicits to get Unnerve on hit, which causes enemies to take 10% increased spell damage and a source of elemental damage leech. Any of the 3 elements are fine for the leech mod, but fire damage leech is probably the best since our endurance charge generation is the most reliable. The Path of Building link also includes a gear loadout for the Mercenary. I'm using a Fallen Reverend for his Zealotry loadout. The gear on the Mercenary is somewhat flexible, but the mandatory pieces are Doryani's prototype, along with some mist-reflected jewelry to lower the Mercenary's lightning resistance. I use Defiance of Destiny to help keep the Mercenary alive. He's literally never died on me with this equipped. I highly suggest Kaum's Binding in the belt slot. Physical to fire damage conversion for nearby enemies is a big survivability boost against physical hits, which doesn't show up in Path of Building. The rest of the gear is just there for life regeneration rate, plus a Shaper-influenced helmet with nearby enemies take increased elemental damage. The passive skill tree is quite straightforward. You'll be pathing from the duelist start in the south of the skill tree, around the west side of the tree up to the very north. The mandatory nodes for the build are the maximum power charge nodes, which provide all of our damage scaling, and inexorable at the southwest of the tree, which provides our endurance charge generation via the self-damage mechanic. Remember that the timeless Jewel Keystone Supreme Grandstanding is also mandatory for our charge generation, so socket an Elegant Hubris to the left of the Duelist start to transform Unwavering Stance. The rest of the build's passive points are flexible. Look to pick up Spell Critical Strike Chance and Critical Strike Multiplier, Block Chance, Jewel Sockets, and as many life nodes as possible. You can choose to skip the Block Chance if you wish, but it makes the build much smoother to play while mapping, and it's actually very efficient to cap block using a very large Thread of Hope in the Southern Jewel Socket, along with Versatile Combatant. I hope that this video has given you some ideas of tech that you can work into your own builds. If you enjoyed the video, or are interested in more content of this type or in-depth build guides with an emphasis on mechanics, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.